had. A few years ago, Dr. Gary Schwartz was with us from the University of Arizona, Harvard-educated. He had written a book called The Afterlife Experiments that blew my mind and the minds of everybody who heard about it. Now he's back, and he's got something so astonishing that it is going to change the way you think about who you are, what you will become, and what those around you and your loved ones who have died have become. It is simply called The Truth About Medium, and yes, that's the show that's on TV right now, that wonderful little series Medium. It turns out that Medium is not only based on the work of a real medium, she's somebody that Dr. Gary Schwartz has worked with and knows well. But that's just the beginning of this astonishing story, because it is a story of contact with the afterlife so convincing that if you do not believe that this is possible, you're going to change your mind. If you have thought perhaps it's possible, you're going to change your mind. If you do believe that it's possible, it's going to inspire you, because beyond even the abilities of these mediums is your ability to do this. It is truly an eye-opening and mind-opening experience. Welcome, Gary Schwartz, to this radio program.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Well, good. I'm so glad. And I want to begin sort of with the beginning of The Truth About Medium. Tell us first a little bit about your relationship with Allison DuBois and how it came about.
Well, Allison originally came to my laboratory in the winter of 2001, coincidentally 2 days after someone who I had dearly loved had died. This was a woman named Susie Smith.
Yes.
And Susie had actually published 30 books in the field of parapsychology and survival of consciousness after death. She was almost 90 years old when she died. And this was the first time that, since I had begun this work, that someone that I thought I was really close to, who, by the way, was also a researcher in this field, had passed. Anyway, Allison showed up with a woman by the name of Catherine Yount, who was essentially Allison's mentor at the time, was helping teach her mediumship skills.
Now, what was Allison's purpose for contacting you? She proactively phoned you, or?
That's correct. The way she tells the story in her book, Don't Kiss Them Goodbye, which is actually a pretty accurate rendition of our experience, she claims that she saw something on television that I was in. I think it was maybe Dateline, and her, quote, guides told her that she was meant to meet me, to be tested by me and the laboratory, to participate in the research, to verify whether her apparent abilities were real. By the way, no one had up to that point, claimed that they were seeing me because their guide sent them. That was a novel experience. So anyway, she was there.
Gary, I don't want to keep interrupting your narrative, but it's important that I do so, because we've heard the word guides 1,000 times on this radio program. This person's guides, that person's guides. But now I'm actually talking to somebody who may have a clear idea about exactly what that means. What are her guides?
Well, actually, that's a good question, and I can't tell you precisely what her guides are. But in terms of the multiple mediums that we have worked with, guides are supposedly spirits that they receive communication from. Their guides could be people who they knew, like grandparents or other loved ones who had passed on. Guides could be people that they never met in the physical, who lived, who were advising them. Guides could be otherworldly beings. Some people claim that angels are their guides. The guide is just simply a word for someone who gives you information that will supposedly help you.
And who are themselves in some state on the other side.
That's correct.
Okay, well, let's go on with the story now. Allison arrives and led by her guides to come to you, and here she is.
Right, with her mentor. And they're telling me this, she's telling me this story about, that they had been waiting for some time to see me and that they had pressured to get an appointment and so on. And because Susie had died just 2 days earlier, and they didn't know this because this was not, public knowledge, I decided that I was going to do an impromptu little experiment. I was going to ask each of them if they could get information about someone who I knew, who I loved, who had recently died. I gave them no details about age, sex, where this person lived, where they would have come from, and so on. And I gave them virtually no cues. And much to my both surprise and pleasure, each of them obtained significant information specifying an older woman who had difficulty walking and who fit the description of Susie Smith, including, for example, their knowing that Susie had an unpublished manuscript that Susie was wanting to have published, and there were only one or two people alive who knew about that secret manuscript. So it was an auspicious beginning. Let's just put it that way.
Yes, I should say,
testing, whether Allison was the real deal or not. So that's how it began.
Now, Allison wasn't the only medium that was involved in this process.
No, well, certainly after Susie died, I actually went to a total of 6 different mediums independently to see whether we could get accurate information about Susie's passing. And I actually published 2 papers with a former colleague that described some of those very remarkable sets of readings. As I affectionately tell people, Susie was, so to speak, my adopted grandmother. She used to call me her illegitimate grandson. And as I'm affectionately, telling people that Susie couldn't wait to die so she could prove that she was still here. And the book, The Truth About Medium, is actually dedicated to Susie because she was involved with many of the experiments.
Now, you make a very interesting comment about Allison DuBois, who is the basis for Medium, I might add, folks. You say Allison evidenced a kind of brashness that is not common in people at her stage in life. But I should know I had a similar quality when I was her age. You're referring here to the fact that she literally can physically see the dead. Now, how does she see them? Does she see them as clearly as they're shown in the show, for example?
Well, first of all, I should say, when I say the equivalent brashness, I didn't see dead people. I never have. What I meant by brash was this sort of strong-willed, of course I can do this, kind of, youthful, matter-of-fact, just...
Well, I understand that, yeah.
Okay. Now, getting back to her, she says that she literally sees. I can remember, I think it was the second time that we met, that she was in the lab, and she said, Susie's sitting in your desk chair over there. And then went on to describe her. And it was, as if Susie was actually sitting in the chair. So she does, quote, see. That's what she says.
As I've occasionally seen the dead, I actually have a lot of this in my life. And of coming into contact with dead people and animals. My pets have shown up and so forth. So I really relate to that. But now let's go on to the specific testing that occurs early in the book, because this is one of the things, and I think it's important. It's empowering to us. Tremendously empowering to a degree to take this out of question and make it part of our lives, because we can have a much bigger, richer life if we have knowledge of the presence of the dead around us, I think.
And I completely agree with you.
Absolutely. And so in a way, and all of us, even those of us who say, I am convinced of this, aren't. Because we live in a culture that is relentlessly telling us, no, 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 no. And it tells us no, not only by denial, but by the vast silence that surrounds this reality in the culture. You just don't see it anywhere except in fiction. And we'll get to that and the significance of that, which Gary deals with in his book very eloquently later. But now let's talk about the specific statements. There was a grandmother figure. Now, all three, you had three people, Esther and Gussie, your two actual grandmothers, and Susie, your titular grandmother, who could have answered to that statement. But now, Allison, can you take us through this this sort of graph you have, if you will, in the book, and let us...
Oh, sure.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, what I did was that as a way of indicating to what extent is a statement vague in general and can apply to virtually anyone versus it's specific or not, I used as a comparison my two respective grandparents, right? Because that's the first step that one would use. And after each statement that Allison would make, I mean, I did this later, of course, not while she was actually doing it, I then compute what we call running totals. So, for example, when she says there was a deceased grandmother, well, I have two deceased grandmothers plus an adopted grandmother. So that kind of statement would fit all three people. Okay? Then she said the woman was short. Well, it turned out that Esther was short and Susie was short, but Gussie wasn't short. So there was a case where we have a running total of two yeses for Esther and two yeses for Susie, but one for Gussie. And then she says the woman was surrounded by flowers, especially roses. Well, my grandmother Gussie used to paint flowers and was very attached to flowers. Susie also used to paint flowers, but Esther didn't. So now you've got, 2, 2, and 3 for the total. So the question is, when do you start getting details that distinguished Susie from just a normal, grandmother who, for example, loved flowers, where most do?
Right.
So she says, for example, she died quickly of some cause associated in the chest area.
Right. Now, that's getting more specific.
That's getting more specific, and it just so happened in this particular case, Susie died from a massive heart attack, and that kind of a death did not apply either to Esther or Gussie. Or she says she cared about the sitter but used to tease him. Well, my grandparents, teasing was not something that anyone would describe them in terms of their behavior toward their grandchildren, whereas Susie was just a complete and total tease. But again, you could say that that's somewhat general. But then she says, she's showing me a newspaper. That's very strange. Well, there's a detail that's highly specific because, you see, Susie had been a newspaper reporter. Also, the obituary to Susie, for Susie, was being published just that morning in the Tucson newspaper. Now, these people were coming in from Phoenix, so they wouldn't have seen this. But what people didn't know is that Susie had actually written her own obituary and had read it to me while she was still alive.
So
I was the one. What? Yes.
This is
I was the
very
one who
specific
actually,
now.
It's highly specific.
Yeah, and it's not only specific. It's not like somebody catching somehow or another the fact that she had an illness or a wart on her nose or something like the skeptics all say that these mediums do. This is so specific that it is really beyond. It's beyond that kind of guesswork.
Absolutely.
But it gets even more specific, folks, and we're going to come back in just a minute. We're going to get into this a little bit more deeply. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We're talking with Dr. Gary Schwartz. His fabulous new book, The Truth About Medium. It is available in stores everywhere. You can get it from us, from the unknowncountry.com store, and we've got a special deal on Medium Plus, the paperback edition of the Afterlife Experiments. And so if you want to get it from us, you get a great deal. Now, things are going to get much, much more specific, and it reaches the point where it's almost impossible to believe that Susie wasn't there. What would you say as this builds through the first few pages of your book, of The Truth About Medium? What would you say just kind of did it for you? I guess I'm sort of expecting you to talk about the manuscript.
Well, within that very first reading, I would have to say it was the manuscript, because first of all, when Catherine then chimed in and said the deceased grandmother had an manuscript completely written that you are aware of. Now remember, virtually nobody knew that. And then she says, the deceased wanted this manuscript published in her honor. Now, the in her honor part is you could say is questionable, but the wanting me and pushing me to get this manuscript published and promising that I would, find a way to do so was something that Susie was very committed to. In fact, I think most people don't know that she actually wrote this book for me for my 54th birthday present. So it was a very special thing, and again,
none of these people knew about it, knew anyone who knew about it, or could have known about it. They couldn't have investigated it and found out.
Well, what they would have had to have done is they would have had to, number one, have known that Susie had died, right? Number two, they would have had to have known details about Susie, including the secret, the manuscript. They then would have had to come in and fake not knowing, because they had no idea that I was going to do a reading with them. I mean,
right.
This was something that was completely and totally spontaneous. So, in order for this to be fraud, it's so untenable. Right?
If they had known about the manuscript in another way, all it would prove would be that they were different kind of psychics.
Well, yeah, they could have read my mind, of course.
Right.
But that's a different story, and we get to that later on in the book. But, yes, I mean, I think that for me, meeting Allison and Catherine, there were these mediums always get general information. I mean, if your grandmother dies, the medium can't help saying that, I'm seeing a grandmother. I mean, that's because it's true. Or if she says that, and the grandmother's name is Mary, well, yes, Mary is a very common name, but if your grandmother's name is Mary, it's Mary. So the fact that it's general, and it could apply to many people, is not the fault of the medium. But when they give highly specific information, and also unique information not just for this specific person, but even more importantly, for research in the area. I mean, remember, I've witnessed hundreds of research readings, and do you know how many times a medium is saying the deceased is showing me that there's a manuscript of hers that's unpublished, that you know about, that she wants to have you published?
Well, not all of it.
Right.
I mean, because the ones who are fakes are playing off of the body English and or like I was at a party a few weeks ago where the amazing Kreskin was a performer.
Sure.
And, he was quietly walking around, listening to people and so forth during the party and not making a big deal of it. It was very pleasant. And then when it came time for his performance, he astonished us all with mentalist tricks that are basically as old as Kreskin himself, or even older. And but there was no mediumship involved. It wasn't. It was not. I've always thought that some of these people like that probably do have abilities that they themselves don't acknowledge, but that's another story. But this is very different. This is very different. However, because this is buried. This is buried, and yet they're pulling it out of the buried world.
Of course, but you see, as interesting as this initial informal little experiment was, I mean, I didn't take it very seriously, meaning I had to see this replicated over and over with experiments that are much more impressive, such as the one that we talk about regarding Deepak Chopra, where Allison was one of the 3 mediums who participated, and where it was done long distance. The medium couldn't see the person. The medium didn't know who the sitter was, wasn't allowed to talk to the sitter, and yet was able to get exquisitely accurate information that fit Deepak's father and didn't fit my father as a matched control. That kind of experiment is much more convincing. As we get into the book, folks, words like triple blind come begin to appear. Gary, I have to tell you, he tries hard to make this not work, real hard. That would be true, I think. Yes, I think that as the research has unfolded, we have made it ever more difficult for both the mediums and the sitters, the people who are wishing to hear from their loved ones, and I think even the deceased. We've made it ever more difficult for this to occur unless it's real. And in the triple-blind experiment that we described, much to my absolute amazement, the results are still there.
Amazing, I know. You also have an experiment with Princess Diana, involving Princess Diana, that surprised me very much because, oddly enough, one of the people that I have met in the afterlife situation was Princess Diana, and I've never spoken about this to anyone because it sounded so stupid. Of course, he meets Princess Diana and Queen Nefertiti and the Pope, etc., but never anybody from down the street. Not true. I don't even recognize most of the people I meet. I have no idea who they are, but I meet them all the time. That was one who stood out, and interestingly enough, also one whom I can occasionally successfully call, which isn't very common with me. And we're going to talk later, folks, about what Gary thinks is actually going on in the afterlife. I mean, what are they seeing? What do they do? Where do they go? What's it like out there? Okay, and we're going to, in just a couple of minutes, we'll be right back, and we're going to go roaring on down an extraordinary path. And I think that the truth about medium, one thing you could do with this book is if you have anyone in your life who has recently lost a loved one, or you yourself are in that position, or you have someone in your life who is perhaps facing death or has a serious illness, this would be the kind of book to give them. It's not a long, complicated book. It's a short, sweet, marvelous read, and it is a bridge, a real bridge to the afterlife. Do not try to believe this. It genuinely is. This is Whitley Strieber. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. I'm talking to Gary Schwartz, Dr. Gary Schwartz's new book, The Truth About Medium, available from the unknowncountry.com bookstore. If you want to get a special deal, get it with the Afterlife Experiments, his previous equally wonderful book. Here is a man who is making a frontal assault using the tools of science on the mysteries of the afterlife and getting extraordinary results. Now, before we go to one of the most remarkable experiments I have ever heard, which is the experiment involving Deepak Chopra, let's talk a little bit about Princess Di and the Princess Di experiment.
That was truly remarkable. And by the way, I have to say that I find it meaningful, if not potentially synchronistic, that you, the interviewer, would also be receiving communication from her, because I now have to, as you know, come to the conclusion that this is extremely possible, if not probable, and we can always scientifically test it and confirm it under the conditions that we did. Now, let me briefly tell the story here. There's a woman by the name of Hazel Courtney, very famous health reporter for the London Times, who about 6 years ago had a severe illness, almost died, and in her recovery, she had a whole slew of anomalous experiences, which is often described now as a, quote, spiritual emergency. And one of these experiences was that she believed that she was receiving communication from Princess Diana, who she knew in life, and that Princess Diana played a critical role in her recovery. Okay. Now, she wrote a book called Divine Interventions, and then went back to her main life. As a reporter, she published 2 more books. Her editor said, gee, it would be valuable if you could do a follow-up book about what it's like, if you would, to return to normal life. And how do you explain the phenomena that happened to you? And that's how she ended up contacting me. And she wanted to know, what if there was any way that I could determine whether any of this was real. And I said, well, one thing we could do is determine whether or not Princess Diana is actually around you. And that is, have you be a secret sitter. So imagine that she's a secret sitter, and the person that we're looking
define
to...
your term, if you will, secret sitter.
Yeah, sitter means someone who wishes to have a reading, who wishes to hear from a secret loved one. And so it's the person who is, potentially grieving a loss or whatever. A secret sitter is someone where the mediums do not know the identity of the sitter, they do not know the identity of the deceased, and the sitter gives essentially no feedback, no communication that would enable the medium to know what information is correct or incorrect. And what Hazel did was she
and often they're not even in the same room. I mean, they're not in the same room. Town.
In fact, they can even be, in the case of the Deepak Chopra reading, they can even do the reading at a time when nobody's present, including the sitter, and we don't even know when the reading's taking place, i.e. they do it in the privacy of their own home. Okay. So anyway, Hazel flew out, and she served as a secret sitter. And there were 2 mediums who were in town at the time. One of them happened to be Allison, and the other one happened to be Lori Campbell. And each of them she was not allowed to speak. She wasn't allowed to be present in the room because she was a reporter writing a book, so I wanted her to be able to have experiences. Anyway, in the book, which is described in some detail and also in her own words, you'll see the description of how, first, in both cases, both mediums received communication from her mother, evidence of her mother's presence. And by the way, she was not there to hear from her mother. And they got highly specific information. And then each of them, with great shock, said, essentially, I don't understand this, but I'm seeing this either in Paris or in England. I'm seeing someone that looks like Princess Diana. And they're embarrassed, because Princess Diana doesn't show up in a research reading.
It is embarrassing.
Of course.
I've had the experience. I'm having it now, in fact. So
I love it. I absolutely love it. And anyway, so they looked to me and they said, what are we supposed to do? And I said, you know the rules in science. You are to get whatever you get. You're not to filter it, and I can't give you any feedback. So just go with what you're getting. At which point, both of them received highly evidential information, some of which was information that was known to Hazel and wasn't known to me, obviously, much of which could not be shared publicly, and some information Hazel didn't know, and it was confirmed with some of Princess Di's relatives. And when I asked the mediums, I said, well, gee, what is the relationship of this deceased person to the sitter? Okay, they were both very confused. They would say things like, and I'm paraphrasing, they'd say like, well, she's sort of around her. They're like friends. They have like a mind-to-mind connection. I think even Lori may have said something to the effect of how that she played a critical role in sort of saving her life from an illness. I mean, it was just, and they couldn't describe the relationship. They said, well, it wasn't family, and it wasn't, a real friendship. It didn't fit any of the stereotypes, which was true. I was
quite amazing.
Floored. By the way, since the book was published, I've had at least one other person come to me, but this happened before the book was published, but it was to be published, so nobody knew about it. An anonymous businessman in the Greater Phoenix area contacted me claiming that he was receiving communication from Princess Diana. Talk about, coincidence.
Yeah. And
I ended up ultimately having a medium, her name is Debbie Martin, do a blind reading. And, much to my disbelief, who shows up again? Princess Diana.
But, my impression of this particular spirit is the desire there to do work in this world that she was denied the right to do, that perhaps she came here to do, and the conditions under which her life emerged and her suffering prevented her from doing a great deal of this. Or it's also a possibility that she kind of acquired a taste for it as she grew older, that the dutiful attitude of an English aristocrat made a tremendous impact on her, and she's not finished trying to help people in this world. Interestingly enough, during the course of this conversation, as I knew would be the case, and I never make a big deal of this, I don't consider myself a medium, but the dead are around, and in this particular case, this one is holding a little object like it almost looks like a man's watch in her left hand, holding it sort of bent so that you can holding it in her hand. I don't know what that would be about, but that's typical of the kind of things I see, and probably that someone listening to the show that will have significance for, and I'll get an email about it. But
that would be wonderful. By the way, I have to tell you something, and I've never done this on the air. Are you ready for this?
Sure.
I would like to propose, in her honor, because from multiple mediums, including, by the way, mediums who knew her in life, okay, who were secret mediums to her since all this has happened, they all confirm. They confirm what you were saying about her and about her commitment to the world, that her work was not completed. And as I affectionately tell people about Susie Smith, Susie gives a new meaning to the phrase, our work is never done, and that certainly is the case for Princess Di. What I would like to suggest is the following, that we do an experiment with you being a secret sitter. And what we would do is one of the deceased people that we would invite in, which would of course be Princess Di. The second would be another deceased person who's also very strong that you don't tell anybody about, including me. So what would happen is you and your wife, for example, would put into an envelope, the name of this second person. So we would have some independent verification that this other person was also part of it. Then we would do an experiment, and the mediums, since we're always doing blind studies, they never know at any given moment whether the secret sitter is a famous person or not, or whether the secret deceased is a famous person or not. And then we would give the opportunity for Princess Di to appear again with you.
Interesting. So what should I do exactly? Should I send this envelope to you, or?
No. I don't want to.
You wouldn't want to see it.
We might actually have it, certified, put into a vault, something like this. We might have it. We'll figure out the details.
Okay.
So, because here's what we don't want. People always accuse. They say, well, and all else fails, since they find it hard to believe that this is real. They say, well, the experimenter must be cheating.
Yes.
And one of the things I describe in the book, in the section on skeptics, is that is the phrase that Professor Charlie Tart first shared with me. He said, Gary, he said, if you design an experiment that is such where the only criticism left is that the experimenter could have been cheating, then you've designed a good experiment.
Yeah, right. And it's challenging to design these experiments. I can certainly see that from both your writings in both books, and very challenging. By the way, Gary, I know Ann is going. Well, I'll let Ann talk to you. Gary, let me put it this way, folks. Ann is going to be interviewing Gary for the subscriber section, and Gary's doing some work now that's going to come out in another book in about a year. And just tell us the title.
Sure. It's actually going to be appearing, I think, in 6 months.
In 6 months.
The book is called The God Experiments. It's spelled G.O.D., which stands for Guiding, Organizing, Designing Process. And the subtitle is How Science is Discovering God in Everything. including us.
Okay, we're going to leave that there, and you and Annie and Gary are going to be talking about that for our subscribers. Gary, we're coming up on another break, and when we get back, folks, we're going to go over two subjects. We're going to talk about the Deepak Chopra experiment, and then we're going to talk about what Gary thinks this all means. I mean, if the dead are around, do they stay around? Do they go somewhere? What's it like out there? This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber. It's Dreamland, and we will conduct the experiment that Gary proposed a little while ago, and I will keep you up to date with our progress on the website. Now let's go on, Gary, if you will, to the Deepak Chopra case, which is an amazing, amazing story. Why don't you set the scene for us, and how did Deepak get involved?
Okay. Deepak wrote the foreword for the book, The Afterlife Experiments, after I had given an invited address at one of his workshops, and he was very impressed with the research. And then, after the book was published, a while later, his father died. And Deepak really loved his father. And Deepak called me and asked me whether I could arrange for him to have a reading with one of our Michael Jordans of the mediumship world, one of these really gifted people. And I suggested to Deepak that if he's going to do this and have this experience it, we should design it as an experiment. So instead of having it be one medium, we should have three mediums. It should be completely blind for the major part of the reading. These mediums should be invited to receive information before the actual telephone reading occurs, so that he can actually see how mediums can get information before things begin. And also we have what we call the double deceased paradigm, where we essentially invite a deceased person such as Susie to bring the deceased loved ones of, let's say, Deepak Chopra to a given medium. So what the medium does is they ask for Susie, and Susie brings along the other deceased people. It's an amazing paradigm. Deepak thought that was a wonderful idea, so I arranged for three mediums, and the mediums did not know who the other mediums were. Of course, they didn't know who the secret sitter was. The only thing I told the mediums was that this person was important, and the work was important. Okay? And one of them was Allison, and one of them was Lori, and the other one was Mary Ochino, a very gifted medium on Long Island. And we actually did the experiment. I actually flew out to California at a resort called the La Costa, where Deepak's center is, and I ran the experiment. It was all both audio taped and videotaped. And what happened is I would call, for example, Mary and say, okay, Mary, we're about to begin. First, what I would like you to do is to read in whatever information you received before the telephone call. So think about this. Mary is now telling us about aspects of supposedly Deepak's loved ones, particularly his father. She doesn't know who he is. And she hasn't even heard from me yet. Okay. She gives us information. Then I say, okay, Mary, now for the next 15 to 20 minutes, what I would like you to do is to try to contact these people and just speak out loud and give us whatever information you can. And you won't be given any feedback. You won't be yes or no. Don't hear anything. But the sitter is going to be listening in, so the sitter is able to hear, what's going on, because they're scoring it. And then after the official experiment was over, then and only then did I allow Deepak to actually talk with the medium. And then they had a, quote, normal reading. Now, at this point, the reading's no longer blind, and I didn't treat it as scientific data. So the question is, what happened? To what extent did each of these mediums get information about a father figure? And to what extent did that information fit Deepak's father? And the answer is that it was extraordinarily accurate. I mean, Deepak's average ratings in terms of percent accuracy was approximately 80%, where mine was in the mid-20s. which is just like we've found in the past about what happens when you rate somebody else's person versus you rate your own. And this information was not just, again, vague general information like I'm seeing a father figure, and the father was, somewhat middle-aged when he died or something. We're talking about highly specific details that fit his father and did not fit my father. And Deepak was just, as you can probably imagine, extremely impressed by their abilities. My favorite piece of evidence, by the way, had not to do with Deepak's father, but actually with one of his uncles. And Mary Ochino, at one point she says, "I'm seeing this man. He looks like an uncle, and he's showing that he had throat cancer, and that his vocal cords were removed before he died." Now, I've had mediums get information about cancer and even gotten about throat cancer, but I had never heard a medium claim that the man's vocal cords were removed before he died. And I was sure that was going to be wrong. Turned out Deepak did have an uncle who he dearly loved. His uncle did have throat cancer, and his vocal cords were removed.
I want to just interrupt you here for a second with something.
Sure.
Okay. During the course of this conversation, my dead have been around me, specifically just within the past 2 minutes, my father. You began to talk about this uncle moments after my father appeared, which he does not often at all. Okay. He had throat cancer.
Really?
And had his vocal cords removed. That's correct. Go ahead. Quite extraordinary. Quite incredible.
Now I've got the chills.
Yeah. So this folks, what's happening here shouldn't be taken as unusual. What the dead are doing is they are trying to communicate with you. I mean, that's why you listen to this radio program, is to get the empowerment that you need to do this. And here,
Whitney, put yourself in my shoes. You're a scientist who's written a book. You're being interviewed for a radio show. You have no idea that the interviewer is a, so to speak, a closet medium who receives significant communication, and therefore the possibility of these kinds of events occurring on air would actually happen.
Well, the other side of the coin is I hadn't actually read the part about the uncle at all in the book.
Really?
No. I mean, I was wondering when you started talking about the uncle where that was, in fact, because it wasn't something that I had.
No, it's not featured in the chapter. It's buried in the tail end of that particular chapter.
Amazing. Just amazing. Okay. Gary, let's now go on to the large question of what, after all of these years of experiment, do you think, give us a picture in your mind of what the world of the dead might be like.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me tell you that it's only within the past year, and only one chapter of the book really speaks to this forcefully. We're doing a sequel to this book called The Truth About Survival, which lays out the case very strongly for the conclusion that not only are mediums real, but that they're genuinely speaking to the deceased, as opposed to, just getting information from the universe or reading the mind of the sitter. So the first critical take-home message is that survival of consciousness is real. And that's a conclusion that I have come to as a scientist who was raised to believe that this was impossible. So for me, it's been a tremendous transformation. I jokingly tell people that you've heard of what's called PTSD, PTSD, post-traumatic.
Oh, I know it well,
disorder.
Believe me.
Okay. Well, I suffer from what I call PESD, a post-education stress disorder. and I'm just now, I think, healing from it, at least in the arena of survival of consciousness. So the first thing is that our loved ones, their energy and consciousness is like the light from distant stars. It continues long after the star has quote, died, and it is flickering and evolving just as the universe is, okay? So then the question is, okay, what's life like for them? And also, why are they, quote, still here? Well, let's take the second one first. Why would someone stick around the Earth if they had the opportunity now to have complete freedom, no longer constrained by a physical body? They can go anywhere they want and do anything that they want to do if they have a mind to do it. Well, the number one reason that people would choose to be here is love. They stay because they love their children, they love their spouses, they love their friends. It starts personal. Then there are beings like Susie or Princess Di or, believe it or not, Albert Einstein or Edgar Cayce or all these other individuals who haven't left. And their commitment is not just to individual people that they've known and loved. They have a commitment to humanity, and they have a commitment to the Earth. And they see themselves as in service. And so just as when they were on the planet, they had great caring for humanity, for animals, for plants, for the ecology, those loves do not disappear simply because they've shed their physical body. And we are blessed on this planet that these wise and caring people are still here. What we need to do is to create a structure for them to be, voices to be able to be heard, and for them to be able to communicate. And people ask me, they say, gee, Gary, why haven't you made it possible for these beings to be able to communicate in an effective and scientifically credible way? You want to know the truth, Whitney? The answer is, I was afraid to.
Yes.
It was so controversial. You know, I get in so much trouble as it is.
Yeah, I know you do. You get in.
I get it from both sides.
The skeptics love you.
Right. Well, the skeptics love me. Yeah, right. The skeptics have a field day. Some of the scientists who are skeptics have a field day. Believe it or not, there are mediums who are unhappy with the directions that the lab is going because we're raising the standards and requirements for research mediums to be in the lab, and which is making more demands on them. Even some sitters aren't happy that we're doing this work. It's just so interesting that, and yet, why are we doing it? First and foremost, for love, which includes, by the way, the love of truth. Wanting to know whether this is real, and if it's real, how can we use it for the benefit of all of us? So that's a huge issue. The other thing, of course, is you say, well, what is life like for them? Well, one of the things that it appears to be, number one, is that the biases and the blinders that people have on the Earth seem to continue after they die. Just because they die, it doesn't mean they shed their knowledge and all of a sudden they become wise, loving, mature individuals. If someone has been wounded, if someone believes that all of this is impossible, they might actually still think they're alive. That is, literally, physically alive.
Yes.
Also, the whole notion about being able to use your mind, you know that we can be very creative with our minds in the physical, but we can't manifest most of what we imagined. Well, apparently, after you die, you can manifest much more. You know, what you can think is what can happen, and this gives tremendous freedom. The other thing which I love to talk about is that the evidence suggests that, as I affectionately put it, it's easier to multitask on the other side. In other words, you know, I could be here talking with you right now on the radio, and I could be thinking about visiting one of my dear friends in Taos, and I could think about collaborating with a research project with the Forever Family Foundation, which is on Long Island. It's a wonderful foundation called the Forever Family Foundation. It's called foreverfamilyfoundation.org, founded by the Ginsbergs. I could hold all three of those thoughts in my head simultaneously, but I'm physically stuck.
Right.
At this phone.
You're not actually doing all three things.
Right. I mean, I could be imagining and talking and so on in the head, but I'm physically still grounded in Tucson. On the other side, you can literally, quote, split yourself. So you can be in multiple places. So the claim is, at the same time.
Well, Gary, I would like to thank you very much for being on Dreamland. We have run out of precious time, and it has indeed been precious, folks. The truth about medium. Don't miss it. Get it from your local bookstore. Give it to whoever in your life needs it the most. You'll know who that is, and it may be you yourself, but do not miss it. The truth about medium, and watch the show. The show has got a lot of resonance to it that is valuable. Admittedly, it's a fictionalized version, but it's fiction based in the real experience of mediumship and the real journey, the remarkable journey between life and death that we are just now, with little halting steps in the Western world, beginning to take. Thank you so much for being with us, Gary Schwartz. Linda Moulton Howe will be next up, and Gary and Ann Strieber will be talking for our subscribers. You're about to experience something that you just can't get elsewhere. Emmy Award-winning science reporter Linda Moulton Howe reporting on the absolute leading edge of science discovery and the true mysteries of the unknown. Don't miss her website, earthfiles.com, the one science website that tells you the secrets and gives you the facts that others dare not. earthfiles.com. This week, she's reporting on the slowdown of the Gulf Stream and the dangers it poses, plus those footprints found recently in Mexico, thought to be 40,000 years old, now found to be 1.3 million years old. But are they really human? Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. Over the past few years on Dreamland, I've interviewed a lot of oceanographers studying the Gulf Stream in the Atlantic Ocean, which is also known as the North Atlantic Conveyor. The Gulf Stream's warm water originates down in the Caribbean, and it has heat that it gives off, and it's roughly the equivalent output of 1 million power stations. And it's the reason that Great Britain and Western Europe have a milder climate than, say, Labrador on the same latitude. But by the time that warm water reaches Greenland and Iceland, the water has cooled so much that it sinks, and that is called overturning, as the cold water returns back south to warm up again. That conveyor belt cycle of warm to cold to warm has persisted, even though global warming computer models have shown that as the Arctic and Greenland ice melt and fresh water dilutes the Atlantic salt water, that dilution could slow down or even stop the North Atlantic Conveyor. Last week, the journal Nature published data samplings over the past 50 years of accumulated information about the Atlantic Gulf Stream in a research report by the UK's National Oceanography Centre. British scientists concentrated on the overturned flow of cold water returning south. The change was much bigger than expected. The amount of cold water returning south now has declined by 30%. That overturn weakness means less heat will reach England and Western Europe. Computer models have predicted that if the Atlantic Conveyor turns off completely, Europe could cool down as much as 4 to 6 degrees Celsius, which is 39 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Ocean and climate experts say this is the first observational evidence that a decrease in the North Atlantic Gulf Stream is happening. In fact, the slowing down of the southward return of cold water is going all the way down to 3,000 to 5,000 meters. That's between 2 to 3 miles deep. Scientists now say that if this trend persists, northern latitude temperatures could lower about 1 degree Celsius or 34 degrees Fahrenheit over the next 20 years. That's not good news for England. The UK's National Oceanography Centre at Southampton University is now going to monitor the Atlantic Conveyor even more closely for signs that maybe this is a reversible trend. If not, the impact of steadily cooling temperatures on Europe's economy and environment will be a major challenge. In other British science news, this past summer on the 4th of July at the British Royal Society Summer Exhibition Program, geologist Sylvia Gonzalez from Liverpool's John Moores University announced that what appear to be human footprints in volcanic rock near Puebla, Mexico, were 40,000 years old. You can see two clear prints that she calls right foot and left foot at my website, earthfiles.com. Go to www.earthfiles, and at the top of the headlines page are these two prints and a hot link to this report. It's important to take a look at the at least the prints that this scientist in Britain is basing the statement that these are human footprints. Now, this 40,000-year-old date was determined from what is called optically stimulated luminescence of some baked particles in this ash that's now turned to rock. Dr. Gonzalez and her colleagues had first discovered these footprints in 2003, and over the last 2 years, she has hypothesized that early hunters walked near a lake there across freshly deposited ash from volcanoes that are still active in the region. And that ash mixed with rain and water over time and turned to rock that's volcanic. Who those early humans might have been is also hypothesized by Dr. Gonzalez to be related to some of the ancient skulls that have been found, such as the Peon woman, aged around 13,000 years old, and the Paracues, who became extinct at the end of the 18th century. The Paracues might have been associated with the first Native Americans due to their skull characteristics. And at my website, earthfiles.com, I have a map about what the migrating routes of ancient people might have been from Asia to Alaska and down the Pacific coast to Mexico, Central and South America. Until recently, archaeologists thought that early inhabitants arrived at the end of the Pleistocene, which lasted from about 1.65 million to 10,000 years ago. The theory has been that hunter-gatherers migrated from Siberia into Alaska, across the Bering Land Bridge, which was exposed when sea levels were lower during ice ages. This hypothesis is known as the Clovis first model, and it dates back to about 11,500 years. But the July 2005 announcement by Dr. Gonzalez that fossilized human footprints have been discovered in 40,000-year-old volcanic rock near Puebla, Mexico, challenged the Clovis model. Unfortunately, so far, Dr. Gonzalez has not yet published her research in a peer-reviewed journal such as Nature or Science. Her submissions to Nature were twice rejected. Several American archaeologists have expressed doubt about her alleged footprint discovery. And one of those doubters is Professor Paul Rennie, director of the Berkeley Geochronology Center, an adjunct professor of geology in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at the University of California, Berkeley. He first heard in 2004 about these alleged 40,000-year-old human footprints and wanted to see for himself. He was already working on a Mexico site and asked a colleague to take him to the volcanic rock prints to collect rock samples. Professor Rennie did not do work on them then, and he didn't until he was literally provoked by the July 4th, 2005 press release from the British Royal Society Summer Exhibition Program and the huge media storm that it created. Then he applied the argon-argon technique to date the volcanic rock. In the December 1st issue of the journal Nature, Professor Rennie reported that the Puebla, Mexico rock is 1.3 million years old, not 40,000, and raises the question, could those be human or hominid footprints that old? near Puebla, Mexico. Professor Rennie.
Then I realized, okay, this has become an issue, and I'm going to try and resolve it. So it was really only after the press release that I decided I would go ahead and do the work. So our results are really fresh off the press, literally. I mean, to have done the analyses, written it up, and published it within a period of about 4 months that's pretty quick. When this group reported evidence of human presence 40,000 years ago, this was quite a revolutionary thing. And if it's valid.
And these footprints in that volcanic rock are unique in South America, Central America, Mexico, at least as far as scientists know to date?
Well, no. If they were truly footprints, then they would be unique. The question is whether they are truly footprints. But I heard rumors about these footprints, and I wanted to see them. So one of my colleagues, a fellow named Mike Waters at Texas A&M University, who had been there before, took me to see the site, and I had one of my graduate students with me, and we looked at the surface, and after half an hour or so, we concluded, no, these are not footprints. They didn't look like footprints. We knew that we were in exactly the same place that this other group had been because we have photographs showing various, bushes and so forth, rocks, and you can see that it's the same place that this other group has reported on their website. So we knew we were looking at the same features that they had seen, and what we saw was a huge variety of shapes of markings on a surface of a volcanic ash, which is pretty hard. It's well cemented, and you can make dents in it or chisel it out, but it's sort of like a really crumbly asphalt, let's say.
And it is 1.3 million years old?
Yeah, it's a volcanic ash, and what we've done is to have dated the pieces of rock that constitute the ash, and we've done a number of these, 9 different pieces of it, and we get the same answer, 1.3 million years. And then we furthermore also analyzed the magnetic field that's trapped in these rocks, which is a reflection of the magnetic field that the Earth had when they were erupted. And we find that the polarity is reversed compared to today's magnetic field. And this requires, there's a couple of very important things that follow from that. One is that the last time the Earth's magnetic field was reversed was 790,000 years ago. So this tells us that the rocks had to have been erupted longer ago than about 800,000 years, which is consistent with the argon-argon dating that we've done.
Which is the 1.3 million.
1.3 million, right. But the other important thing that the paleomagnetic data tell us is that the ash was erupted and deposited while it was still very hot, because it had to cool through its magnetic Curie temperature after it had stopped moving in order to explain the consistency of our results. So this tells us that the ash wasn't erupted and deposited somewhere 1.3 million years ago, and then perhaps eroded and deposited somewhere else, say 40,000 years ago. So we can rule that out. So the upshot of all this is that it's very clear that the ash is much older than anybody would think possible for humans to have made them. In fact, humans, as if you define them as being Homo sapiens, weren't even around yet. They didn't appear in Africa till the last 200,000 years. So if, and it's a very remote possibility in my view, if they were made by hominids, they would be something like Homo erectus. And while this would be a very exciting possibility, it's extremely improbable. So I think,
let me just ask for a second, is it improbable because you can't come up with a mechanism of how the Homo erectus would have gotten from Africa to Mexico?
No, I don't think that's a really insurmountable problem. In other words, we know that Homo erectus got from presumably from Africa to Indonesia, to Java specifically, but as long ago as 2 million years ago. So Homo sapiens' ancestor was capable of extreme migration. So I don't think it would be at all impossible for Homo sapiens to have migrated. The problem is, why don't we see any other evidence? Homo sapiens or Homo erectus both they leave footprints, so to speak, and I'm using that term loosely here, but I mean, they leave evidence. They were making stone tools, they were doing all kinds of things. And there has been a huge amount of archaeological research in the United States and in South America, Central America. It's inconceivable to me that we wouldn't have found some other evidence by now. But let's just say, in the extreme case, that it's just, everybody's found it, maybe people have found things and they've said, well, you know, this is impossible, it can't be that old, so I'm just going to dismiss it, which is kind of the conspiracy theory mentality. So let's say, well, you know, it's theoretically possible. We should not close our minds to this option. And, you know, I agree with that to some extent. So we have to go back and look at the footprints themselves, or the purported footprints, and ask ourselves, are these really footprints? And I started out describing this story to you by telling you that I was completely unconvinced, and I think most people who have seen them are completely unconvinced. But if the group that is making this claim really believes that they are footprints, and they will not be swayed by the evidence that's starting to come out against it, then there's a very simple thing that they have to do, and that is to excavate the layer in which these markings occur and find the same layer in a place where it's still buried by overlying sediments. So it's been protected from any sort of human commerce. And that's a real problem with the surface, because there are tire tracks. I mean, cars and trucks drive over it. People are quarrying building stone from this area. They use this ash as a building stone. And so what they need to do is to dig and excavate the same layer from a place where it's completely undisturbed and find real convincing footprints. Then they'll be taken seriously. So I think if they really believe this, it's a pretty simple task to prove it. And
if they weren't footprints, what do you hypothesize they might be?
Because there are vehicles driving across the surface, you get a rock that just rolls out onto the surface. And there are lots of rocks scattered around on it. You can see that today. The truck comes along, hits the rock, and what happens, the mechanics of what happens there are actually pretty easy to prove by experiment. What happens is the rock gets forced down really quickly, and it makes a little divot in the surface, right? And then it gets bounced out. So then you have a divot in the surface, and it might be, a few millimeters or half an inch or something. And now you've got a low point, so other rocks that then roll out on the surface when it rains or whatever come to rest there, and then another truck comes along, and boom, the divot gets enlarged. And because trucks are coming and going in the same direction, or to and from the same place, what's going to happen is these divots get worn in kind of an elongated way, so they sort of look like footprints in some cases.
What about you and your colleagues, or Dr. White, doing your own research to look in these layers below, seeing if there are any tracks?
Well, I think there's a couple of issues there. One is that ethically, these people were working on that first, and I think they're entitled to make their case. And it's a free country. We're entitled to tell them how they should do it. But yeah, I mean, they should have the right to either prove themselves right or wrong. And in science, I mean, science is self-correcting. That's something a lot of people don't really appreciate, but there are always people looking over your shoulder. And if you make a mistake, it's going to come to light sooner or later. There's no vast conspiracy of scientists all trying to prove each other right all the time. Scientists are actually vicious competitors, and they will prove you wrong if you're wrong. So there's that sort of tendency, but at the same time, I think we really would like to see our colleagues, if they're wrong, arrive at that themselves and admit it gracefully and really, preserve some dignity. There are many cases of people who've been proven wrong and they just refuse to accept it for the rest of their lives, and it ruins their careers. They become bitter, and people tend to start viewing them with a lot of skepticism, and it's just very bad. It's better. It's just like your mom told you, when you took cookies out of the cookie jar and you weren't supposed to. You should admit it and move on, and everybody will forgive you, basically. So that's, we want to give them that opportunity. And if they are right in some, in this most improbable possible way, then I'll be the first to say, wow, congratulations, you've made the discovery of the century.
Right.
I just don't think that's going to happen.
What's interesting, Whitley, again, is presentation of evidence. When Dr. Gonzalez makes her presentation, and she shows what are called the right and left footprints, they look like footprints. And in fact, one at earthfiles.com shows the left foot of a human today, live, right next to a left foot. It certainly looks like a left foot with toes in this rock. Dr. Rennie's photographs that he took on site, they show what look a little bit more to me like heel marks of a shoe, meaning that they are kind of they have the quality of something that would be like half of an oval. And the difference between those photographs are confusing, I think, to most everybody. And this is a story, as he told me. He said, it's not over. This is unfolding. They've got this date that nobody is arguing with now, the 1.3 million. Well, that pushed back the idea of humans making these prints so far that is why this is now so controversial, because up until this release in 2005, it was assumed, really assumed by the archaeology community that we weren't talking about flows of people from Europe and Asia into Central and South America until about 10 to 12,000 years ago. But how would we explain then that if you're down in Lake Titicaca and you talk with Peruvians, they think that Lake Titicaca was a civilization 40,000 years ago? This is a big mystery, and as I learn more, I'll keep reporting on Dreamland.
Well, it's an interesting mystery, Linda, because it's not the only totally anomalous, apparent set of footprints that has ever been found. And there are some that were found in North Texas that have been pretty well debunked, and there are some footprints that were reported back in the 30s and that are appear in William Corliss's book, his books of anomalies and artifacts. So in the case of the Corliss prints, this was what appeared to be a print of a moccasined foot in a very, very old formation. So, and yet he said he felt like they weren't footprints at all. She's gone on record as being outraged that this was done before her paper was published.
Right, and I think that his point was that they had been making press announcements when apparently she had been having trouble getting her work published in Nature or Science. And I don't know the details behind all of that. I am going to talk with her. I was not able to for this week. the news was the release of this 1.3 million argon date by Dr. Rennie at Berkeley. So, in a way, this is like step one. I definitely will talk with her, and hopefully they are going to get their data published with more information about these, what I'll call the provocative right-left footprints, which are very different from the ones photographed in general by Professor Rennie. And science always has the issue of evidence, hard evidence, and where we're all struggling with is how old are Homo sapien and hominids, and how far has this distribution been? And if I may just raise the question that has come up ever since I was shown that briefing paper by Richard Doty at Kirtland Air Force Base on April 9, 1983, allegedly about extraterrestrial biological entities interfacing with this planet, was this sentence that has come up in other people's experiences and interactions with the government, and this was, extraterrestrial biological entities have manipulated DNA in already evolving primates to create Homo sapiens. Now, if any of that is true, then the whole mechanism of moving humanoids, hominids around the planet is suddenly up for grabs.
You know, someone as eminent as Francis Crick felt as if the human species was the product of design on some level.
Right.
And the question is, who did it, if anyone did indeed? And it's a question that I don't think science right now is able to address in any meaningful way, because there's too much junk, as it were, surrounding the whole question of aliens being around and so on and so forth. So as soon as you bring that up, then no respectable scientist is going to stay in the room. They're all headed out to the door to save their careers, and justifiably so, given the atmosphere.
Right, but you and I can bring it up as another box context for some of this work. And in today's report, it's, to me, the solid part is what Professor Rennie at Berkeley has contributed here, that the dating on that lava rock, that volcanic rock, is apparently indisputably 1.3 million years. So there's a piece of hard data. If somebody can prove that these are hominid or human footprints, then 1.3 million years becomes a new benchmark to explain how humans or hominids were walking around on that volcanic ash in Mexico 1.3 million years ago.
Well, I'll be really surprised if it turns out that there's anything remotely resembling a hominid footprint in the Americas that long ago. I mean, I won't fall off my chair. Well, Linda, we are coming to the end of our time together, and I have enjoyed it greatly. What have you got on your plate? What are we looking forward to in the future?
Well, let's see. I'm working on several stories that will range from real X-Files through science and the environment. And I'm going to try to bring to Dreamland next week a very interesting real X-Files. I will keep it mysterious so that our audience will tune in. And as we go into January of 2006, can you believe it? 2006.
Oh, dear. 2012 is coming closer.
Right. I was just starting to say, 6 years away. That I'm going to try to do a continual mix every week on Dreamland of science, environment, and real X-Files.
Well, Linda, it's been a pleasure. And, folks, stay tuned. Next week, that it occurs early in the book, because this is one of the things, and I think it's important. It's empowering to us, tremendously empowering to a degree, to take this out of question and make it part of our lives, because we can have a much bigger, richer life if we have knowledge of the presence of the dead around us, I think.
And I completely agree with you.
Absolutely. And so in a way, and all of us Even those of us who say, I am convinced of this, aren't. Because we live in a culture that is relentlessly telling us, no, 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 no. And it tells us no, not only by denial, but by the vast silence that surrounds this reality in the culture. You just don't see it anywhere except in fiction. And we'll get to that and the significance of that, which Gary deals with in his book very eloquently later. But now let's talk about the specific statements. There was a grandmother figure. Now, all three, you had three people, Esther and Gussie, your two actual grandmothers, and Susie, your titular grandmother, who could have answered to that statement. But now, Allison, can you take us through this this sort of graph you have, if you will, in the book, and let us...
Oh, sure.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, what I did was that as a way of indicating to what extent is a statement vague in general and can apply to virtually anyone versus it's specific or not, I used as a comparison my two respective grandparents, right? Because that's the first step that one would use. And after each statement that Allison would make, I mean, I did this later, of course, not while she was actually doing it, I then compute what we call running totals. So, for example, when she says there was a deceased grandmother, well, I have two deceased grandmothers about Susie's passing. And I actually published two papers with a former colleague that describe some of those very remarkable sets of readings. As I affectionately tell people, Susie was, so to speak, my adopted grandmother. She used to call me her illegitimate grandson. And as I'm affectionately, telling people that Susie couldn't wait to die so she could prove that she was still here. And the book, The Truth About Medium, is actually dedicated to Susie because she was involved with many of the experiments.
Now, you make a very interesting comment about Allison DuBois, who is the basis for Medium, I might add, folks. You say Allison evidenced a kind of brashness that is not common in people at her stage in life. But I should know I had a similar quality when I was her age. You're referring here to the fact that she literally can physically see the dead. Now, how does she see them? Does she see them as clearly as they're shown in the show, for example?
Well, first of all, I should say when I say equivalent brashness, I didn't see dead people. I never have. What I meant by brash was this sort of strong-willed, of course I can do this, kind of, youthful, matter-of-fact, just...
Wait, I understand that, yeah.
Okay, now getting back to her, she says that she literally sees. I mean, I can remember, I think it was the second time that we met that she was in the lab, and she said, Susie's sitting in your desk chair over there. And then went on to describe her, and it was, as if Susie was actually sitting in the chair. So she does, quote, see. That's what she says.
As I've occasionally seen the dead, I actually have a lot of this in my life, and of coming into contact with dead people and animals. My pets have shown up and so forth. So I really relate to that. But now let's go on to the specific testing. Yes.
And Susie had actually published 30 books in the field of parapsychology and survival of consciousness after death. She was almost 90 years old when she died. And this was the first time that, since I had begun this work, that someone that I thought I was really close to, who, by the way, was also a researcher in this field, had passed. Anyway, Allison showed up with a woman by the name of Catherine Yant, who was essentially Allison's mentor at the time, was helping teach her the mediumship skills.
Now, what was Allison's purpose for contacting you? She proactively phoned you, or?
That's correct. The way she tells the story in her book, Don't Kiss Them Goodbye, which is actually a pretty accurate rendition of our experience, She claims that she saw something on television that I was in. I think it was maybe Dateline. And her, quote, guides told her that she was meant to meet me, to be tested by me and the laboratory, to participate in the research, to verify whether her apparent abilities were real. By the way, no one had up to that point, claimed that they were seeing me because their guide sent them. That was a novel experience. So anyway, she was there.
Gary, I don't want to keep interrupting your narrative, but it's important that I do so because we've heard the word guides 1,000 times on this radio program. This person's guides, that person's guides. But now I'm actually talking to somebody who may have a clear idea about exactly what that means. What are her guides?
Well, actually, that's a good question, and I can't tell you precisely what her guides are. But in terms of the multiple mediums that we have worked with, guides are supposedly spirits that they receive communication from. Their guides could be people who they knew, like grandparents or other loved ones who had passed on. Guides could be people that they never met in the physical, who lived, who were advising them. Guides could be otherworldly beings. Some people claim that angels are their guides. The guide is just simply a word.
A few years ago, Dr. Gary Schwartz was with us from the University of Arizona, Harvard-educated. He had written a book called The Afterlife Experiments that blew my mind and the minds of everybody who heard about it. Now he's back, and he's got something so astonishing that it is going to change the way you think about who you are, what you will become, and what those around you and your loved ones who have died have become. It is simply called The Truth About Medium, and yes, that's the show that's on TV right now, that wonderful little series Medium. It turns out that medium is not only based on the work of a real medium, she's somebody that Dr. Gary Schwartz has worked with and knows well. But that's just the beginning of this astonishing story, because it is a story of contact with the afterlife so convincing that if you do not believe that this is possible, you're going to change your mind. If you have thought perhaps it's possible, you're going to change your mind. If you do believe that it's possible, it's going to inspire you, because beyond even the abilities of these mediums is your ability to do this. It is truly an eye-opening and mind-opening experience. Welcome, Gary Schwartz, to this radio program.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Well, good. I'm so glad. And I want to begin sort of with the beginning of The Truth About Medium. Tell us first a little bit about your relationship with Allison DuBois and how it came about.
Well, Allison originally came to my laboratory in the winter of 2001, coincidentally 2 days after someone who I had dearly loved had died. This was a woman named Susie Smith. For someone who gives you information that will supposedly help you.
And who are themselves in some state on the other side. That's
correct.
Okay, well, let's go on with the story now. Allison arrives and led by her guides to come to you, and here she is.
Right, with her mentor. And they're telling me this, she's telling me this story about, that they had been waiting for some time to see me and that they had pressured to get an appointment and so on. And because Susie had died just 2 days earlier, and they didn't know this because this was not, public knowledge, I decided that I was going to do an impromptu little experiment. I was going to ask each of them if they could get information about someone who I knew, who I loved, who had recently died. I gave them no details about age, sex, where this person lived, where they would have come from, and so on. And I gave them virtually no cues. And much to my both surprise and pleasure, each of them obtained significant information specifying an older woman who had difficulty walking and who fit the description of Susie Smith, including, for example, their knowing that Susie had an unpublished manuscript that Susie was wanting to have published, and there were only one or two people alive who knew about that secret manuscript. So it was an auspicious beginning. Let's just put it that way.
Yes, I should say.
Testing, whether Allison was the real deal or not. So that's how it began.
Now, Allison wasn't the only medium that was involved in this process.
No, certainly after Susie died, I actually went to a total of 6 different mediums independently to see whether we could get accurate information